We have all heard about how AI is going to change how we learn, how we educate our kids, and even potentially make college irrelevant. But what if I told you there's more technology than just AI that is shaping the future of education? We are, of course, talking about augmented and virtual reality. What we're talking about today has deep roots in learning science and principles that we've known for a really long time. Whether you're a parent, an educator yourself, or someone who needs to continuously learn for your job, this conversation will give you the latest research-backed methods that you can take and implement in your life, your kids' lives, or in the classroom. Welcome to Becoming Dauntless, the podcast where we talk about what it means to be dauntless as entrepreneurs, as parents, and friends. I'm Laura Elliott, the CEO and co-founder at Dauntless XR.
And I'm Sophia Lazaro, the other co-founder and chief product officer here at Dauntless XR. Together, we strapped our tech startup from a pitch deck and an idea to $1 million a year business.
Each episode, we explore the latest trends, breakthroughs, and stories from the front lines of business ownership. Whether you're an aspiring entrepreneur, an engineer, a business owner yourself, a seasoned professional, or just curious about the future of technology, there's something here for you.
Join us as we uncover what it means to be dauntless.
I'm Laura Elliott, and I'm joined today by Sophia Lazaro, my co-founder and co-host. And today on the Dauntless podcast, we have Dr. Sara Smith. Dr. Smith is a professor at the University of Florida, where she specializes in language education, applied linguistics, and innovative approaches to bilingual learning. With a PhD from the University of Oxford and a career that spanned research labs at Harvard to classrooms in the UK, China, and the US, Sara's work sits at the intersection of language learning and technology. But that's not all. She is also an award-winning researcher, a National Science Foundation grant recipient, and even holds a patent for an augmented reality language learning system. We're excited to dive into her insights on XR and education. Dr. Smith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the very flattering introduction.
Well, we're lucky enough to have worked with you before, so we know that all your insights actually back up all the amazing things that you've accomplished, and we're really excited to pick your brain and learn what you're thinking and what you are hearing about in the research. What does the research say today about XR and its role or potential role in education?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been working on XR in education for like more than 3 decades now. I think people really think of it as super brand new, but XR has had a kind of an S shape, like a swing up in education every time a new technology comes out, going back to like simulations on desktop computers. So every time the XR kind of picks up with a new technology, we have a huge flurry of research, and then sometimes it drops away. But I think XR has this staying power with each new technology because it really taps into some of these fundamental principles of how people learn. And so every time a new technology allows us to kind of push XR forward, we bring it back into education again and reconsider, hey, how can this new technology really let us harness what XR has to offer for learning potential? So it's super exciting. And I think we're finally at the point where we really have the technology to use XR across many different age groups, many different contexts, many different subject areas, and to do it really well. So I think this is a really exciting point where the technology has caught up with like our XR dreams as researchers and educators, or we can really allow it to reach its full potential versus maybe when we first started and people think of these like kind of older clunky VR simulations. And they're like, I don't know, was that so good for learning? Now we really are at the point where the technology has caught up with it.
Yeah, we can relate as developers in terms of it does feel like the timeliness of this, because for a long time, there was more that we could do on the software side than the hardware could actually support. And now we're getting closer and closer to being able to bring to life all the things we want to do. Not everything yet. We still need to balance that compute power with ergonomics, but we're getting so much closer to what we're able to do on a headset today compared to when we started Dauntless years ago. Speaking of the where the research is at now, what are any recent findings on XR's impacts when it comes to learning outcomes, engagement, and maybe even accessibility?
One of the things that's really exciting with XR is we are testing it all the way down to like little, very young learners, like pre-K, all the way up to high school. And we're seeing learning benefits from little all the way up to young adults, as long as the tools are, of course, appropriate for the age group. So for findings with young learners, we see huge benefits, especially for motivation and engagement. For young children, adding these sort of interactive characters, adding these elements that add, we call them like pedagogical agents, but you can think of it as like Dora in Dora the Explorer, right? That type of character to help share in the learning and help add that extra element of kind of magic and whimsy that you can get with XR. And I think it's sort of uniquely tailored to really appeal to young learners and up that engagement, up that motivation. And then consequently, we see greater learning gains. And also that learners can persist with an activity a lot longer when you make it exciting like that. So we see those benefits, especially among younger learners. And then when you go all the way up to high school, we see a lot of benefits, especially for abstract concepts. So we're talking like STEM, right? When things become really challenging, the ability to visualize stuff, to simulate realism, and to give the learner a chance to sort of interact with multimodal components really, really helps for science, technology, engineering, math, right? High school physics, all of these places where we might want to support, especially struggling learners with some additional content. Also really good for collaboration. This is another thing we're finding, especially for high schoolers, giving them the opportunity to collaborate on like a shared activity in XR has really good outcomes. So across the board, we see greater motivation and engagement for learners. That's where XR across the board shines. And then for different age groups, we see learning gains depending on the types of activities we're doing with the XR. So of course, you don't want to give cartoon characters to high schoolers. That's not where we're going to see the benefit. And you don't want to give abstract three-dimensional models of chemistry molecules to children. But as long as we make sure that what we're doing is tied to the learner's age group and content, we see fantastic benefits for learning gains and increased long-term recall, which I think is also important to kind of throw out there. It's not just that they're learning more in that moment, they're also keeping what they're learning longer.
The retention piece was something we saw carry over to adult learners as well. It's one of the stats that we frequently will cite when different companies are looking at bringing in XR for onboarding and training. And that's one of the benefits that we end up talking about a lot is the retention piece. So I'm sure we'll get into that more later because it's a kind of core component of what makes this technology so effective. One thing I did want to ask about, because I could see people having a visceral reaction to being like, you're putting kindergartners in a headset to talk about the devices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people don't realize how much they have XR in their own lives. And sometimes when you say oh, we're developing an AR app for pre-K, and people are like, what? You're putting a kid in a headset? No way. I mean, if you have any type of smart device, you probably are really familiar and using a lot of AR in your life. If you have ever used a filter on a picture of yourself, which of course I never have, but maybe someone has, right? That's just you overlaying a virtual image over your view of the real world, right? Perhaps view it's your face and you're trying on glasses. Perhaps that view is your classroom and you're seeing what it would look like if that chair was in the corner. Perhaps it's your face and you're seeing what it would look like if your skin were a little smoother, right? That's all forms of AR. And so when we're thinking about, especially XR tools for young children, there are some really exciting tools out there that make reading a lot more magical and whimsical and inviting for learners where they can, for example, scan a word in a book and see an animation overlay. So characters might pop up if they're viewing that book by holding a tablet over it. So we're not talking about wearables here. We're talking usually about tablets and also smartphones. So learners being able to use the camera on those devices to look at the world around them and then add on top of it something extra that makes the learning experience richer.
I wanted to point out the device accessibility part as well, because I was thinking, I go to my PTA meeting and I'm like, I start saying we need to have an immersive curriculum, and they're thinking I need to go buy 500 headsets. I would be laughed out of the room. But as you pointed out,
not just buy, but train. I need to buy 500 headsets and train the teachers to use those headsets. Yeah.
Of course, if you have that option available and you have older students, absolutely go for it. But as you pointed out, most people have access to augmented reality, maybe some virtual reality on your phone already or tablet. You don't necessarily have to go out there and buy a whole new device.
And we see in high school classrooms, people even you can print out a cardboard headset and then just slot a smartphone in there. And those are really fun tools. One of the tools we see in high school classrooms get used a lot is the Google Earth VR. And that's a really fun one where you can just use a smartphone. You can create your own headset out of a printable. You can even use card paper and create a really fun learning activity reality.
Yeah, that's effectively what the Google Daydream was, which was the first headset I ever purchased. And it was
Oh,
a great,
really?
yeah, you just popped your Pixel in there and then you could swim with
Mhm.
sharks. So I love that.
That's awesome.
But you mentioned how aligned XR is to fundamental principles of learning. What are those principles of learning and why is it that XR is so deeply connected to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it really goes to the core of why, as educators, we and researchers, we are so excited about XR and why we are so focused on making XR work really well. So we've known for a long time that the mind is part of the body, right? The physical body is part of learning. And going back to like the 70s, there were these approaches when were called total physical response. I even was trained in this when I was like teaching younger learners, where you like get up and you use your body to like do physical movements while you're teaching new information. I don't think people really are that into total physical response anymore. But we've known for a while that the body is part of learning. And we have a lot of theories called embodied learning, which is just thinking again as the physical body is part of the learning experience. The mind isn't separate from the body. It's not like we should think of these as two totally different entities. And instead, we should think of how we can create an experience that is going to go into our memory of ourselves, our memory of our own autobiography of the things that we've experienced, and that can be part of the process of learning. And part of how we do that is by creating this environment around ourselves, by having input through multiple modalities. So seeing something, hearing something, experiencing something physically, and having that total experience that then allows us to offload some of the cognitive demand and really create a memory with that. There was this landmark study that found that if learners studied for a test in the room where they're going to take the test, that actually improved performance. And on the one hand, you think, what on earth would that have to do with anything? But it was the experience. And there were so many elements of the physical body in that room that they could actually offload some of that cognitive demand onto the other things in the room. The smell of the cleaner in the room, the feelings and sounds of being in that room could, in a sense, hold some of those memories for them and trigger that memory of this declarative content. A history test, for example, could become part of an experiential memory because it's tied to your physical space. My work is in language learning. So for me, I'm all about how can we help you learn a language? How can we help you acquire all of the thousands and thousands of new words that you need in order to learn a language? And when we introduce a new word, some of the research indicates it might take 7 to 12 exposures to that word to learn it. Let's say you're learning Italian. I'm trying to teach you the word for bread. I might need to, in a classroom context, give you that word in the textbook, ask you to produce it. We might need to do that 7 times, maybe even 12 times. But everyone had this idea that, something about immersion experiences, something about going to a place and actually having an experience, we can actually be kind of one and done, right? You can encounter a word for the first time and you can acquire that word right away. And so on the flip side, instead of me sitting in a classroom with you, telling you the word for bread over and over, you can be sitting at a meal with your Italian host family and they can hand you some bread and you can smell it and you can be having that experience of having fun, of laughing, of delighting, of feeling warm, of having that sort of emotional memory. And they say, would you like some bread? And that might be your first exposure to the word bread. And you may have that word from that point on, right? And so when we think about immersive technologies, it's basically creating this new, almost like a loophole for us where we don't have to take you to Italy. We don't have to sit you down, right? Maybe you won't have the smells, you won't have the full experience, but we can still create for you this experiential component to your learning where you have the opportunity, hopefully, to use your body in some way to see something that is interesting and exciting and integrates itself into your environment. Maybe not get you all the way, but stand in that middle area where we're able to tap into all those benefits from experiential learning and to leverage technology to tap into them and make your learning experience not only more fun and more engaging, but ideally more robust. And I think that's especially important when we think about young learners, when we think about content areas that learners might find less enjoyable. What can we do to create an experience that is going to really, really optimize the learner's chance to do super well in this subject area?
As you were saying that, it reminded me of the Magic School Bus. I loved that show so
Yeah.
much. And I think that's what they were trying to achieve is we can't actually take you to all of the planets or inside a volcano, but you can do that through a TV. It had characters that were very identifiable to a 7-year-old. And XR can take some of that same
Yeah.
experience, but make it even more realistic than looking at it through a screen. And you also reminded
Yeah.
me when you said you don't get the smell. This is a bit of a sidebar, but there was a company, they might still be around, that was working on adding smell to an XR experience like that and I found it deeply unsettling.
I think I tried one of those headsets at a conference and was like, that's not for me.
There's even
And
a
I don't
taste
think it has
simulator now. Have you?
oh no.
Yeah, trying to create like sour and salty and whatever. Yeah, no, it's a thing. I'm gonna have to send it to both of you.
On the one hand, it sounds sort of strange, but on the other hand, I could see it being helpful. But I love the Magic School Bus example. Now imagine if we could like add an XR experience with that, right? The idea that hands-on learning is beneficial is not new, right? We didn't just come up with this, the day we had a headset. We've known this for a really long time. And so I think one of the great things about XR is the directionality is the other way, right? It's not that we came up with some new tech and we're like, can we find a way to use this in the classroom? Completely the other way. We've known that there are all of these things that we want to be able to offer to learners to help them acquire information faster and learn in a way that has more depth, right? Where they learn in a way they're really, truly understanding and creating deep knowledge where they can use it again in a different way in the future, right? It's not just like a one-to-one, I had you memorize this statement, but instead that you have a true knowledge of what it is we're doing, that you can manipulate that information in different ways, that you can use that information across different contexts, that you can like make that knowledge part of yourself and the things that you know and you know how to do. So we've known that for a while that we want to be able to offer this. This technology just gives us that on-ramp for saying, okay, maybe this is how we can help you get there.
I loved your analogy of XR as a loophole. Like there's this linear progression of how we want to teach you a language, and there's a loophole that gets you to a new point faster. It's so interesting. It also made me think about categorizing different aspects of learning as like good, better, best. No one's going to debate that best is going to be sitting with an Italian host family, smelling bread, getting to bite it the first time that you hear the word. But the idea that you could learn that word in one shot versus 10 on the good side, and good is still good, obviously, but the idea that XR can kind of maybe sit in this best or better, it's kind of pushing closer to that gold standard is really cool. So we know it helps with long-term recall. We know the contextual learning helps with the embodied learning principle. Do you feel that there are any limitations to this particular application of technology to education that the research shows, or maybe gaps in the research that could expose limitations that we just don't know about yet?
Yeah, absolutely. The first rule of anything with applying technology to a learning outcome is it has to be done appropriately. So if you do something badly, your outcome is bad, right? In the same way that any technology, if I brought into the classroom and I didn't provide the proper support to the instructor so they didn't know how to use it, or if I didn't ensure that the way I was using the technology was appropriate for the age of the learner, right? If I gave everybody tablets, but they're all 4-year-olds and they have to log in with their username and password every morning, and that doesn't work because they can't read. And, I don't know about the 4-year-olds in your life, but they're not going to be able to do that every morning, right? So I think the first thing is because there's so many different types of XR technologies, it can be really hard to ensure that they're being implemented well across the board. I think that's the first thing is people sort of sometimes try to roll out a really flashy technology. They put either the time burden on the teacher and like, why haven't you figured this out? Or they haven't done the extra lift to make sure this can go in and be applied appropriately in the context. And that's before we even get to the content that it's delivering. And I think that's sort of the second gap, both in the research and in the application. So we have lots and lots of amazing studies where a researcher will design some content. They're either teacher design tools or researcher design tools, right? So coming up with a lesson content, using especially these great open and available AR creator tools, but also some VR creator tools. And they'll try it and we'll do a nice randomized controlled trial or a nice study where we'll compare it. We'll see, hey, better learning gains in XR. And everyone's like, wow, it's so cool. And then that's the end, right? Then that's the end of the study. And so I think one of the big gaps for us is needing enough content that we can really look at how do these learning tools apply when we use them over months at a time, right? How do these apply when we use them over the full scope and sequence as a supplement to a curriculum over time? It's kind of like thinking about a pilot episode of a TV show versus having 6 seasons and a spinoff. We do, in a sense, we do a lot of research where we're just doing the pilot of the TV show or just season 1. And then we're like, everybody loved season 1. What we really need to see is also over time, right? How does this work as we continue on and we produce a lot of content, as we produce a full curriculum, as we use these tools to build on previous knowledge that has also been taught within the tool. That's sort of one of the areas where there needs to be a lot more research. And I think where there's a big space for teachers to be part of the research. There are all these great tools for, like one of them is, I think it's called Teachers Pay Teachers, where teachers use other content that's created by teachers. I really think we need one of those for XR content because I feel like there's a lot being made by researchers. There's a lot of like one-off activities where the teacher has to learn how to use the XR tool, delivers 1 or 2 lessons. Kids are super excited about it. Wow, that worked great. And that's the end, right? That's it. Everybody loved the pilot of the show. There's no follow-on or there's minimal follow-on. So I think that's a huge area where, in particular, teachers have a lot of opportunity, but also as researchers, we need to be like co-creating with curriculum developers and teachers to make sure if we're going to talk about all the possibilities for these tools, we need to also have content that we can deliver with these tools. And that content needs to be good and well designed, right? None of this matters if we're not putting out really well designed content to go in it. So I think that's one of the areas where there's some big opportunities.
I just wanted to jump in and ask about AI in this instance because I can see people being like, can't we just use generative AI to make a bunch of classroom content and like put it on like Katana that everyone can access? And how do you feel about AI making classroom or learning content?
I think I don't know if I don't know if the way I feel right now is the way I'm going to feel forever. So that's something I always want to put out there when especially anything related to AI. I'm like, well, here's what I'm thinking right now. I don't know if this is how I'm going to feel forever. I think there are opportunities to have almost more like a hybrid where there's a human that works with AI to create that content. But I think where we are now, especially if we're creating content for young learners, there really needs to be a human involved here. And not just for quality control, but for ensuring that the content that we're teaching and the way it progresses is done in a manner that's really aligned to be developmentally appropriate for learners and to be optimal for that specific subject area. I'm sure someone will reach out and say, actually, my AI tool can do it. And maybe that's true. But I would say right now, I think a person can use AI to help them. For example, I think a great thing that AI can do is really help generate a lot of content that you can then go through and choose what are the best sentences to use or which of these reading passages might be good and then tweak them a little and work with that AI to help you. I think for something that's truly going to like sparkle and keep young learners' attention, it needs to have a human going through it and doing some of that creation and to ensure that it's not redundant. I think one of the issues with AI, and especially in a classroom context, like we don't have that kind of time, right? So I think the idea of just having AI generate a ton of content to go into an XR context also risks losing the sort of power boost in learning that you're getting by adding XR. By adding the XR, we're kind of, Sophia, like you said, going from good to better. And I think if you're having AI create the content that goes into it, you're kind of moving us back down to good. Like we got that boost, but then we didn't put in really perfected content. So now we're like back down to good.
Point.
1 step forward, 2 steps back.
Yeah.
It's a fair point. XR is a medium, not a full solution.
Yeah.
The medium can use embodied learning aligned to all of these principles to deliver better learning outcomes, but only if the content is also well aligned to those learning outcomes. So it's a fair point.
Yeah. And I think if a person is creating a person with a deep knowledge of the content area and what is developmentally appropriate for the age of learner that you're trying to support, if a person has that knowledge, then they can also kind of get that aha moment of how to use XR to create content that's going to really support learning. I think one of the things that we need to do as educators and researchers who focus on XR is create more of those chef's kiss moi exemplars so that we can really show them to teachers and parents and say, here's our potential here. Help us work together with you to create more of these so that we can have these. And also to say, this is not a replacement for other things that we know work really well. This is a supplement. And in some cases, it's a replacement for things that are not working well. And that's really where we see the role, right? This is not to take away other experiences. This is to take experiences that right now are suboptimal or experiences that maybe are not individualized, right? Not personalized to your learner and creating a more personal experience for your learner. And this is something that we can add on. The burden is on us maybe to do that better and show that better.
We're not trying to replace teachers with headsets.
Yeah.
The other element that I think applies to your research as well that we were talking about was gamification. And that's another one of those terms where people hear it and they're like, that's for playing video games. I don't need that in my child's learning or in my learning. So
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit about gamification, how you've seen it used, maybe used effectively and ineffectively?
Yeah, I feel like gamification has become one of those buzzwords that now both teachers and parents, when they hear it, they're really excited and they're like fully on board and they're like, yes, gamify everything. Like I want my learner to be having a great time the whole time. And if you haven't gamified this, why would we even bother? It's so hard because like most things in life, the answer is like in the middle or, with moderation, which is, I'm someone that also likes to get like super fanatical and really into whatever my exercise regime is or whatever. Like no in the middle. I want to go all the way. But gamification is one of those things that I think it has its time, it has its moments, and it can be an on-ramp to learning. So I experienced this even as an instructor without having wanted to be in the attention economy with my learners. And they're like, instead of lecturing, why don't you just make a YouTube channel? And so I do recognize and want to meet learners where they are, and where they are often used to having experiences that are extremely gamified, right? Across many different things in their lives, they're experiencing these elements of gamification or these elements of like a high attention grabbing experience. Of course, my goal is not to sharply turn away from that and have my learners who are used to all these intrinsically enjoyable elements suddenly have none of them and be like, ugh, this feels very unpleasant. It's about finding that balance. And I think as instructors, sometimes we get resentful when we're told we have to like make everything a super fun game experience. I can only speak for myself. Almost feels like a lack of reciprocity. The learner is going to just turn away if there's even one moment where they're not entertained, where they're not given cutting edge technology, a full sensory experience, something that's super, super engaging, then they're gone, right? Their attention is gone and I've lost my learner. And instead, I want to feel like both the learner and I are here together to learn something, right? I'm standing beside you as we do these tasks. Your goal is to learn. My goal is to help you learn. I think also it's worth acknowledging that a lot of tasks when you move out into the real world are not going to be gamified. And in education, we also want to prepare you for those experiences. One of the things that we can do with XR and with creating these game-like experiences is also use it as an on-ramp. There are some types of knowledge that are not very fun until you get good at them, right? I think reading is a really good example of this, right? Reading for some children can be really hard to learn. And when you're struggling, it doesn't feel fun. But once you get good at reading, it can become extremely enjoyable. It can become an extremely intrinsically motivating experience where it's not that you're reading because I tell you you have to and you're going to get a bad grade if you don't, but instead because you're enjoying the experience. So I think XR, especially XR tools to get young readers excited about reading and gamify that experience and get them on that on-ramp until they're strong readers and they can read, without having these other elements like, the virtual objects popping up out of the book and hearing extra magical audio that aligns with it, something to get them kind of on that on-ramp to reading. And similar even with high school STEM, right? Something where we add these gamification elements, and that is the first step as they launch themselves forward into other experiences, into other types of learning. One way to really see how this can be done extremely well is to look at informal learning environments, in particular museums. There's some museums that have done an outstanding job of using XR to create these sort of informal learning environments outside of the classroom that are so enjoyable. I want to give a shout out to one museum I think does a great job with this, which is the Planet Word Museum in DC. They have an entire XR. It's a library you go into and you can pull the books off the shelves and put them down in a reading area, and they will trigger an entire XR experience where you look down at the book and you see overlaid on it animated characters that like come up out of the pages. You hear audio. In some cases, you hear the author telling you why they wrote that book. You see all these beautiful animations. And so, of course, a child who sees that, it's not that every time they open a book, it's going to literally spring to life and elephants are going to come running across the pages, but it can be this on-ramp right? Where they can have that experience and get really excited about books and see this representation of how opening a book opens up this whole new world and all these characters. And then that may hopefully inspire that learner to later want to continue to read books and want to read that book to themselves.
You've motivated me to want to go to that museum. That's so cool.
It's a great museum. And it's just one example. I think museums and after school programs have done a really good job of using XR to create super enjoyable experiences for learners.
Does XR play a role in reinforcement learning? I was recently in Milan and I went to go see Da Vinci's Last Supper painted up on the wall. And, I've had that experience in real life. And I was thinking, if I had an XR experience like that, like either VR where I could revisit it or mixed reality where I could see it up on the wall, and maybe there's and more educational components to it because you're only in there for 15 minutes. And while that would be impactful for someone who's never seen The Last Supper in real life or any piece of art or science or technology, because I have experienced it in real life, with the XR benefits to that be like a force multiplier?
That's a great question. I don't know that that's been explored in that exact way. If it has, if you're out there and you did that study, please write to me. Send me an email. I want to hear about it. I do know that there's been some really interesting work with this sort of simulated realism and trying to explore XR for learning about the experiences of different people. So you can hear about someone's experience and then learn about it in an XR. So aligning it especially with literature and arts and social sciences. There's been interesting XR with creating experiences to go with poetry so that students can read poetry and then sort of experience that poetry in a different way. And then some work with empathy building, understanding historical characters' experiences, things like that. So I think there's definitely something to be said for encountering the content in one context and then experiencing the content in another context. I think it's a really cool idea. I like it. You should build it.
Maybe the idea, I guess, would be that you get a little bit more return on investment. Like if you did a field trip or something, you can, continue to build upon that.
Yeah. So people have done this with 360 videos where you can take a 360 video and then revisit it. And I know we've been doing this for teacher training. So people can deliver a class, right? Especially for training teachers who are sort of first out. So you can sort of go back and re-experience what you did and kind of look at it and slow it down and look at it from a different angle, especially for those are related to classroom management. So maybe something was hard when it was happening. And now you can go back and relook at that experience.
Yeah, that was what Sophia was talking about earlier with the Google Daydream and the sharks. They had a National Geographic. It was 360 video. You go over the side of a boat and you get dropped into a school of sharks. And there's a hilarious photo and video of me standing in my New Year's Eve going out outfit with a daydream on, holding a glass of wine, screaming because of the sharks and just being in awe. And
it's so funny how physically your body does respond to it.
In one of the earlier days of Dauntless, we had a virtual reality experience. So you're fully immersed of being on a construction site. We did all these cool things where we turned off occlusion so you could just walk through walls. And one of the things that we love to do mostly for the funny pictures and videos was to put people on top of the water tank. So you're 6 stories up. And even though we're in a conference room on flat ground, you put people in there and people react. They start screaming, they fall over, they step back and stumble. And, it wasn't super real. We weren't approaching Uncanny Valley or anything like that. And even at that level, we were still getting that kind of reaction. And I bet everyone we put through that experience back in the day, remembers it because
for better or for worse,
it was low key traumatizing. Yeah. But we don't want that for post education. But in this case,
no.
It's scary where
but memory. Right? Yeah. You made a memory. It went straight in your autobiographical memory. You learned something that you're going to keep with you. Maybe if as you were falling over the edge, an image of bread appeared and the Italian word for bread hovered above it. They would all remember it forever.
Seared to your memory. Yeah.
I don't need to see that 9 more times.
And also we have found anecdotally in our work that if you're in a mixed reality session where you can still see everything around you, but you have digital elements overlaid, that pretty much knocks out any VR sickness or vertigo. All that to say, yes, you want it to be definitely age appropriate. You want it to be appropriate for what you're learning. And then even then we will have alternatives to make sure it's inclusive as well. but we're
Yeah.
getting there. It's a work in progress.
I love those mixed experiences for young children. And one of the reasons I love them so much is because that is where you really see young children collaborate with each other
Yep.
and share the experience together. And I think that is a really beautiful possibility that we have not fully tapped into. We can engage 2 or 3 children doing the same collaborative activity together where they're interacting with each other and they're interacting with the XR experience. And because XR is so exciting for young children, we can really capture their attention and we can get them to talk to each other, to talk to an instructor so they can do a shared activity with, let's say, 2 classmates and a teacher, or with just 2 classmates. And they will continue to work on an activity, on a learning experience that maybe in other settings, it's really hard to get small groups to work on it, or it's hard to get them to work on it for very long and actually pay attention to the activity. And so I think that is another area where there's huge potential for children to be able to together do collaborative learning experiences with XR. And again, kind of go from that good to better.
I think we'll see some really interesting tools come out. And if you ever have a chance to try Aura at one of our conferences, that is a shared mixed reality experience. And it is completely different, I think, compared to being in a VR headset all by yourself.
I think it has huge potential for an instructor to also watch what the learners are doing together. And I think that might really open up some doors for learners to get basically more individualized attention than they would get in a regular classroom setting. So I think that has huge potential. Something like Aura, where let's say 2 or 3 high schoolers could work on something together, but the instructor could also later review what it was that they were doing in the headset while engaging with the activity, or in real time, see what they're doing and maybe provide some course correction if they're getting off track.
That's actually why we developed the multi-user on Aura to start with, was so a pilot instructor could join the instructee in a debrief session and walk them through what happened. It also made us have to develop a lot of other tools to clean up annotations and reset the experience because people are in there moving things around. So it opens a lot of things up and then creates more problems for developers to tackle, but that's okay. That's what we're here for.
That's sort of like everything, right? You like open another door, you're like, oh, look at all of this. Do that content or use that in a home learning context as well. So we can bridge that gap and create increasingly interesting learning experiences in the home context as well. If the learner wants to go deeper on a particular topic, if the learner wants to expand on a particular topic, they can do that in their own time at home. Or parents can say, hey, let's help you go further in this particular area with these tools at home that are going to create really rich learning experiences.
So speaking of resources, if you're a parent or an educator or someone that is in charge of training or managing your own continuous education, how can you get started?
It's hard because everybody's making their own sort of self-designed tools. I will say you can make your own self-designed tools. And sometimes that's the best way to actually get a good feel for what these tools offer to you. There are a few sort of make your own AR tools that are fun to use. There's also Google Earth VR, YouTube VR. Start messing around with those and get a feel for, okay, this is what I can do with this. There's a really interesting open and available authoring tool. It's for AR, but it's a GPS based one. So you can basically, based on locations, create your own fun AR stuff, almost like creating your own Pokemon Go. It's called Glare, Glare, Glare. And that's hosted out of Kent University. And that one I've seen used in really interesting ways, both as sort of self-guided, almost scavenger hunt. You can certainly go to the Planet Word Museum and check that out. But there's also a lot of other museums that have some like AR experiences. And you might even realize that you've already had an AR learning experience. So those are sort of good ways to get started.
I love all of those. One other one I want to plug, which is as I was getting exposed to different headsets. So say you don't know someone who owns one that you can borrow and you don't know where you can go borrow one. There are more like XR escape rooms than you think. There's a couple bigger chains. There's some smaller ones. Laura Lee and I have actually done one together like a very long time ago. But that is also a fun way to just get introduced to the medium. If it's not a medium you're super familiar with and you don't want to go acquire a device, those escape rooms can be really fun. There are a lot of them that are appropriate for older kids. So that's one other thing to look for if you're just looking at getting a little bit more exposed to the technology itself. I think those are a really fun way to introduce someone to the tech.
Well, those were all really great resources, and we have so much impactful information in one podcast episode. Thank you for joining us. Where can people find you? If people want to connect with you, where can they do that?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I have so much fun talking about these topics. So for me, it's just, this is what I would be talking about over coffee or in my free time anyway. So I love the opportunity to have a conversation with two people who have such expertise in this area and who have expertise in a real world context. I think sometimes if we're just focused on research, we can kind of not always have as strong a connection to the real world applications as we should. So I really appreciate that. People can find me either at you can find me at sarasmithphd.com. That's a really easy way to find me, or at my faculty webpage for University of Florida. And it's Sara with no H.
Sara with no H, and we will link both of those down below. Again, thank you for coming on to the Dauntless podcast. And if you enjoyed this episode, make sure you check out this one next.